Hello and welcome back to Kim Reads as we continue with Happy Birthday Kit. Chapter 2, The Waste Not, Want Not Almanac. The next day, Aunt Millie woke Kit early. "Come with me," she said. "Now?" Kit said as groggily. "Yes, time to greet the rosy-fingered dawn," Aunt Millie replied. Kit swung out of bed and dressed as quickly as she could. She saw that Aunt Millie was not wearing the Sunday best clothes she had worn for traveling the day before. Instead, she was wearing no-nonsense work clothes. Her old leather boots had seen better days. Her straw hat looked chewed, and her sweater had mismatched buttons and tiny patches on the elbows. Over her faded but very clean flower dress, she wore a starched iron all-over apron. She was holding 2 empty cloth sacks in her hand. "What are we doing?" Kit whispered as she tiptoed behind Aunt Millie. "Collecting while the dew is fresh," said Aunt Millie. When they were outside, Aunt Millie handed Kit one of her sacks. "We're going to gather dandelion greens for salad," she said. "Dandelions?" squeaked Kit. "You mean we're going to eat our lawn?" Aunt Millie picked out a green and handed it to Kit. "Taste this," she said. Kit took a nibble. "Hey," she said, "it's good." And free," said Aunt Millie. "Let's go to work." It was just like Aunt Millie to see the possibilities in a weed. No one in the world is better at making something out of nothing, Kit thought as she picked. By the time everyone else was up, Aunt Millie and Kit had filled their flour sacks with dandelion greens and also weeded most of the lawn while they were at it. Aunt Millie was a great one for being efficient. That very afternoon, Aunt Millie, Kit, Dad, and Charlie took hoes and shovels out of the garage and started to rip up a corner of the lawn to plant vegetables there. "Wait," cried Mother. "I like the idea of growing vegetables, but couldn't we put the patch behind the garage where people wouldn't see it?" This is nice flat land that gets plenty of sunshine," said Aunt Millie positively. "Things will grow beautifully here. It's too shady behind the garage." "I guess that makes sense," said Mother. Kit could tell that Mother was not pleased to have the lawn torn up right next to her azaleas. The plot for the garden was an unsightly mud patch. Kit herself was doubtful that the little seeds Aunt Millie had brought would amount to anything. The seeds were wrapped in twists of paper that Aunt Millie had labeled and packed carefully in an old flour sack. As Kit planted the tiny gray seeds, she couldn't believe they'd become big red tomatoes, orange carrots, green beans, or yellow squash. But Aunt Millie was cheerfully confident that time, sun, water, and hard work would bring about the magical transformation. "How can you be so sure?" Kit asked her. Aunt Millie considered Kit's question. "I guess teachers and gardeners are just naturally optimistic," she said. "Can't help it. Children and seeds are never disappointing." She stood and brushed off the dirt off her knee. "Save the flour sack," she said. "I'll make you a pair of bloomers out of it." "Bloomers?" laughed Kit. "Oh, Aunt Millie, you're kidding. I couldn't wear underwear made out of a flour sack, for heaven's sake." "And why not?" Aunt Millie asked. "Well," Kit sputtered, "what if someone saw them? I'd be—" "Waste not, want not, my girl," said Aunt Millie tartly. And then, like the spring sun coming from behind a cloud, she smiled. "You'll like the bloomers," she said. "You'll be surprised." Kit soon learned that life with Aunt Millie around was full of surprises because Aunt Millie was full of ingenious ideas. She could find a use for anything, even things that were old and worn out. To Millie, nothing was beyond hope. "There's plenty of good left in these sheets," she said when Kit showed her the ones that were thin in the middle. It was a few nights later. Everyone was gathered around the radio waiting for President Roosevelt, who was going to speak in what was called a fireside chat. Aunt Millie was a big fan of President Roosevelt and his wife Eleanor, and they asked Dad to move Mother's sewing machine into the living room so that she could sew while she listened. She liked to do 2 things at once. "Watch this, Margaret Mildred," she said to Kit. As Kit watched, Aunt Millie tore the sheets in half right down the middle, and then she sewed the outside edges together. "Now the warm parts are in the edges and the good parts are in the middle," she said. "These sheets will last 10 more years." That night, Aunt Millie taught Kit how to take the collars and cuffs off Dad's shirts and sew them back on reverse so that the frayed part was hidden. Kit was pleased to know how to do something useful. She was glad when Aunt Millie promised, Tomorrow night I'll teach you how to sew patches so they don't show. and Kit was proud. As everyone was saying goodnight, Aunt Millie announced, "If you got anything that needs patching, bring it down tomorrow. Margaret, Mildred, and I will take care of it for you." Kit saw that Mother's lips were thin as she tidied up the room. Kit was puzzled. Since Dad lost his job, no one had struggled harder than Mother to save money. Surely she'd appreciated all Aunt Millie's frugal know-how. And yet it seemed that Mother felt the same way about the sewing machine in the living room as she felt about the vegetable patch in the yard. It was just too visible. But Kit thought it was great fun to have Aunt Millie and the sewing machine right in the thick of things. The living room felt cheery and cozy in the evenings, with the sewing machine clicking away while the boarders chatted or listened to radio. Kit liked learning all of Aunt Millie's skillful tricks, like how to use material from inside a pocket to lengthen pants, how to embroider yarn flowers over tears, holes, and stains, and how to darn socks so they were as good as new. Aunt Millie was a good teacher. She was brisk and precise, but patient. "I love the way Aunt Millie takes things that are ugly and used up and changes them into things that are beautiful and useful," Kit said to Ruthie and Sterling as they walked home from school one day. "Just like Cinderella's godmother." "Fairy godmother," said Ruthie, who liked fairy tale. "You know how she turned Cinderella's rags into a ball gown?" "Aunt Millie uses hard work instead of magic," said Kit, "but it does seem like she can do magic." "Maybe you could show her the picture of the Robin Hood party," said Ruthie. "Maybe she could figure out a way how to do that." "I don't think so," sighed Kit. "She sure has a lot of great ideas." Suddenly Kit had a great idea of her own. "You know what we can do?" she said. "We can write down Aunt Millie's ideas. We'll write a book. Ruthie, you and I can write in. Sterling can draw pictures." "What will we call it?" asked Ruthie. "Aunt Millie's Waste Not, Want Not Almanac," Kit said with a grin. "What else? The thing Aunt Millie hates most is waste. It would be a terrible waste if we forget all the things after she leaves. Writing her ideas down will be a way of saving them. We won't tell Aunt Millie about our book. Then, right before she goes home, we'll show her. It'll be a way to thank her." "Is she leaving soon?" asked Sterling. "I hope not," said Kit. "Come on, let's run home and get started before I have to do my chores." Kit didn't have a blank book, so she took one of Charlie's old composition notebooks, turned it inside down, and wrote an unused backside of pages. She divided Aunt Millie's Waste Not, Want Not Almanac into 4 sections: growing, sewing, cooking, and miscellaneous savings. In the growing section, Sterling drew a sketch of the vegetable patch. Ruthie labeled the rows, and Kit wrote Aunt Millie's advice about planting, watering, and weeding in the margins. In the sewing section, Sterling drew diagrams to show how to turn sheets sides to middle and how to reverse cups. Kit wrote out the directions in easy-to-follow steps. Almost every day there was something new to add to the almanac. Aunt Millie taught the children how to trace a shoe on a piece of cardboard, cut it out, and put the cardboard in the shoe to cover up a hole in the bottom. She showed them how to take slivers of soap, melt them together, and mold them into new bars of soap. She also taught the children to save string, basting thread, and buttons, and to be on the lookout for glass bottles to return to the deposit. One day, when Kit and Sterling came home from school, they saw a horse-drawn wagon parked in front of the house. It belonged to a ragman, who paid by the pound for cloth rags. Kit always wanted to get to know the ragman's horse, but Mother never asked the ragman to stop. She said the horse was unsanitary. Aunt Millie, however, was petting the horse and feeding it apple cores. Kit and Sterling were tickled when Aunt Millie let them feed the horse too. "My kingdom for a horse," said Aunt Millie, quoting Shakespeare as she petted the horse's nose. She smiled at the ragman. "If I had known you were coming, I would have gathered up some rags for you. We have some dandies." The ragman was very pleased by Aunt Millie's kindness to the horse. "I'll tell you what," he said. "I wasn't planning to come back this way next week, but for you I will." Kit and Sterling exchanged a glance. Here was a typical Aunt Millie idea to put in their almanac. Save apple cores, charm the ragman, and get good money for your rags. Saturday rolled around, and Kit was delighted when Aunt Millie announced that she and Kit would do grocery shopping. They set forth after Kit had washed and ironed all the sheets and remade the beds. Aunt Millie had her hat firmly fixed on her head and her shopping list written on the back of an old envelope, firmly in her hand. Kit skipped along next to Millie, eager and alert. She was sure to hear more good ideas from the almanac on this shopping trip. Kit had noticed it before. When she was writing about something, she had to be especially observant. Writers had to pay attention. Everything mattered. Kit's heart sank a little when she saw that they were headed to the butcher shop. The butcher was well known to be a stingy grouch. "What would you like today?" he asked Kit and Aunt Millie. Aunt Millie spoke with more of a twang than usual. "I'd like," she said, "to know what an old Kentucky hilljack like you is doing in Cincinnati." Kit gasped. She was sure the butcher would be angry. It was not complimentary to call someone a hilljack. But Aunt Millie's question seemed to have worked another one of her magical transformations. Smiling, the butcher said, "How'd you know I was from Kentucky?" "Because your accent's the same as mine," said Aunt Millie. The butcher laughed. For a long while, he and Aunt Millie chatted and swapped jokes as if they were old friends. "Now," Aunt Millie said at last, "if you got a soup bone and some meat scraps you could let me have for a nickel, I'll make you some of my famous soup." She pointed to Kit. "And Margaret Mildred here will bring you a portion. How's that?" "It's a deal," said the butcher cheerfully. After they left the butcher's shop, Kit hefted the heavy parcel of meat. "Gosh, Aunt Millie," she said, "all this for a nickel?" A nickel and some friendliness," Aunt Millie said. "Works every time." She caught Kit's arm. "Slow down there, child. What's your hurry?" "Well," said Kit, "you and the butcher talked so long, I'm afraid the grocery store will be closing when we get there." Aunt Millie winked. "I hope so," she said. Kit was confused until Aunt Millie explained, "Tomorrow's Sunday and the store will be closed. So just before closing time today, the grocer will lower the prices on things that will go bad by Monday." "Ah, I see," said Kit. Of course Aunt Millie was right. The grocer was lowering prices. Aunt Millie and Kit were able to get wonderful bargains on vegetables close to wilting, fruit that was at its ripest, and bread about to go stale. Aunt Millie bought a whole bag of day-old rolls, jelly buns, and donuts for a dime, a loaf of crushed bread, and a box of broken cookies for a nickel each, 2 dented cans of peaches for 6 cents, and a huge bag of bruised apples for a quarter. Kit was impressed by Aunt Millie's money-saving cleverness. Yet for some reason Kit squirmed. "Everybody in the store must know my family's too poor to pay full prices," she thought. Aunt Millie counted every penny of her change. When the grocers sighed impatiently and the people in line craned their heads around to see what was taking so long, Kit went help with self-consciousness. As they went home, Aunt Millie said, "You're very quiet, Margaret Mildred. What's that Shakespeare would call my merry lark?" Kit spoke slowly. "Aunt Millie," she said, "do you ever feel funny about, having to buy crushed bread and broken cookies and all?" "Everything we bought's perfectly good," said Aunt Millie. "It may not look perfect, but none of it's rotten or spoiled. It'll taste fine, you'll see." "I meant," Kit faltered, "it's hard to be poor in front of people." "Being poor is nothing to be ashamed of," said Aunt Millie stoutly, "especially these days with so many folks in the same boat." Kit shook herself. How silly she was being. Of course Aunt Millie was right. Kit knew she should be proud of Aunt Millie's thrifty ideas. Wasn't that the whole point of the almanac? Kit turned her thoughts to her book. Which section should I put new grocery shopping ideas in, she wondered. Cooking or miscellaneous savings? And that's the end of that chapter. See you later.